Let us travel back in time, not to the sweeping dramas of modern period pieces or the lush palace gardens dotted with swooning courtiers, but to a time more sobering, more restrained, and far more exhausting. The 1500s were not just the backdrop of a fairy tale with velvet gowns and dashing kings. They were a period of constant tension, endless obligation, and no such thing as rest. And at the very center of this precarious balance stood the royal figure, glimmering on the surface, but weathered beneath. It may look charming from the outside, all that brocade and gold, but once the robes were removed and the doors to the council chambers closed, the crown was not a mark of peace or privilege. It was a burden, heavy not only with its real-world weight of jewels and gold, but also with the invisible gravity of expectation. It squeezed down on the temples of those who wore it. It dug into their sleep. It haunted their waking hours. The crown that never comes off. Let's begin, quite literally, with the crown itself. Crowns in the 1500s were symbols of divine power. Crafted by the finest goldsmiths, they were adorned with real jewels, sapphires, emeralds, rubies, diamonds, harvested through questionable means from distant colonies or purchased at exorbitant costs. They were heavy. A typical ceremonial crown worn by a monarch could weigh up to 5 pounds. Imagine balancing 5 pounds of metal and stone on your head for hours during ceremonies, councils, coronations, and public appearances. The physical discomfort alone was enough to trigger headaches and stiff necks. But that wasn't the worst part. The symbolic weight was far heavier. A monarch's every movement, every blink, every decision was scrutinized not only by nobles and foreign ambassadors, but also by the divine. Or at least that's what everyone was taught. Monarchs ruled by divine right. Their authority was believed to come directly from God. A mistake wasn't just a human error, it was a sin, a break in the divine chain. A cracked crown, so to speak, could crumble a kingdom. No pressure, of course. When kings were accountants, it is tempting to imagine kings and queens reclining on velvet cushions, idly sipping wine while listening to musicians in marbled halls. But far from being idle, monarchs were buried under administrative tasks. In the 1500s, there was no such thing as a prime minister with actual authority. The king, or queen, was the government. They were, in essence, the CEO, the operations manager, the treasurer, and the public face of the realm. Every day began with a stack of parchment, decrees to approve, budgets to review, disputes to settle. The monarch was expected to know what crops had failed in the northern counties, which noble family was feuding with another over land, and how many troops could be mustered if war broke out. And war did break out. Often. The 1500s were not a peaceful time in Europe. Whether it was the War of the Roses in England, the Italian wars across the peninsula, the endless feuds between France and Spain, or the crumbling authority of the Holy Roman Empire, conflict was constant. The royal head was not one that rested on soft pillows, but one that needed to remember troop formations, maintain alliances, and calculate grain supply for winter. Kings spent just as much time in spreadsheets, ledgers and wax-sealed letters, as they did in throne rooms. The whispering court. No monarch ruled alone, of course. They were surrounded by advisors, ministers, generals, bishops, and perhaps most influentially, whisperers. The royal court of the 1500s was a hive of gossip, manipulation, and silent threats. At any given time, someone was plotting to rise higher, to secure land, to marry into influence, or to push their rival out of favor. And who stood at the center of this storm? The monarch. To survive, a king or queen had to read people the way a sailor reads the stars. A glance, a pause in a sentence, a shift in tone. These subtle signs could indicate betrayal, ambition, or a brewing rebellion. The wrong word to the wrong noble could lose a throne. Monarchs needed not only military sense and legal knowledge, but also a near-psychic ability to detect deception. Netflix often shows monarchs making grand speeches in candle-lit rooms, followed by applause and unwavering loyalty. Reality was far murkier. A royal could go to sleep with one set of allies and wake up to learn they'd been poisoned by another. Family feuds and political pawns even within the royal family, love and loyalty were luxuries. Marriages weren't unions of affection, they were contracts. A son was a successor, but also a political rival in the eyes of courtiers. A daughter was a bargaining chip to secure a treaty. Siblings, uncles, cousins, anyone with royal blood was both kin and potential threat. Henry VIII of England had to deal with rebellions from nobles who supported alternative claims to the throne. His children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, would one day be forced into their own political labyrinths, where familial love often stood in the shadow of power struggles. And it wasn't just about palace intrigue. Royal families were not immune to public opinion. A failed harvest or a tax hike would lead to rumors, uprisings, or calls for the monarch's head. Literally, the guillotine, after all, didn't come from nowhere. Being royal meant being constantly watched by your court, your people, your family, and your enemies. Endless ceremonies, zero privacy. Modern-day depictions of royal balls and feasts are filled with dance, laughter, and music. In truth, ceremonies were exhausting, long, and often uncomfortable. Monarchs were expected to perform their royalty. Everything from how they entered a room to how they held a goblet was governed by ritual. Walking too quickly, unroyal. Speaking informally, undignified. Showing fatigue, weakness. Even when suffering from illness or grief, a monarch was not allowed to break form. Take the example of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He governed vast swaths of Europe and presided over religious schisms. But even in private, he had to maintain composure, wear formal attire, and engage in ceremonial greetings for hours each day. There was no me time for royalty. Privacy, as we understand it today, did not exist. Servants attended to their bathing, dressing, and sleeping. Letters were intercepted. Conversations were overheard. A moment alone was rare, and a moment truly unobserved was almost impossible. The burden of faith in the 1500s, religion wasn't a personal matter. It was a cornerstone of rule. Monarchs were expected to not only believe but also defend, promote, and fund their chosen faith. A deviation from religious orthodoxy could spark revolt. Consider the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his theses in 1517, the aftershocks rippled across Europe. Monarchs were suddenly caught between traditional Catholic loyalties and the rising tide of Protestant reform. To side with one meant alienating the other. To hesitate meant inviting chaos. Rulers like Henry VIII had to navigate these treacherous waters with extreme caution, or in his case, by inventing an entirely new church and declaring himself its head. But such decisions were not without cost. They split kingdoms, sparked executions, and stained reputations forever. A monarch was not just a political figure, but a moral compass for the nation. Theologians debated their piety, priests monitored their confessions, and the people watched with eyes sharpened by centuries of dogma. To be royal in the 1500s meant being chained to divine expectations, and punished if you failed to live up to them. The myth of power, perhaps the cruelest irony of royal life in the 1500s, was this: you had everything, and yet almost nothing was truly yours. Yes, kings and queens had castles, but many of them were drafty, cold, and built for defense, not comfort. They had food, but royal kitchens served based on spectacle, not nutrition. A banquet might include roasted peacock or a sugar sculpture, but the monarch themselves might be dealing with chronic stomach ailments due to poor hygiene or stress. They had riches, but most were not liquid assets. Gold might be tied up in crowns, tapestries, or gifts to nobles. Much of a royal's income was promised away in debts, wars, and dowries. They had power but were trapped in an endless balancing act, appeasing nobles, satisfying foreign ambassadors, avoiding excommunication, and keeping the peasantry from revolting. They were rich but not free. They were revered but not loved. They were powerful but not safe. When retirement wasn't an option, there was no stepping down. no resignation letter, no early retirement for royals. A monarch served for life and often died before their time, worn down by stress, disease, or violence. Charles V, who we mentioned earlier, did something rare. He abdicated the throne and retreated to a monastery. But even there, he was never truly free of his legacy. The monks reported that he spent his final days timing his own funeral processions in rehearsal, ensuring perfection even in death. For most, though, the end came while still in office, racked with gout, haunted by failures, or surrounded by schemers hoping to gain from their demise. The crown did not allow for rest. It allowed only for duty. Chapter 2. The royal wardrobe was itchy, hot, and deadly silks and velvets looked good on screen, but they were stifling, full of lice, and loaded with toxic dyes. Narrator voice. Calm, even-paced, almost whisper-like. Imagine yourself in a cold stone room just before dawn, in a castle that echoes with the soft shuffle of servants preparing for another day. The year is 1532, and somewhere in the heart of a royal palace, perhaps Hampton Court, or maybe Fontainebleau, someone of royal blood is being helped into what the world would consider glory. But glory, as you'll soon understand, comes with layers, and laces, and lice. Let us begin. The morning ritual. More armor than outfit. The royal dressing process in the 1500s wasn't just a task, it was a ceremony, a quiet parade of fabrics, pins, cords, and the soft breath of underlings whispering formalities. A king or queen did not simply pull on clothes. No, dressing was a social act, a signal of rank, power, and proximity to the sovereign. This routine could take hours. A monarch might begin in a linen undershirt, yellowed by time and sweat, before being slowly wrapped in an underdoublet, followed by a doublet proper. Then hose, a codpiece, perhaps a farthingale or kirtle. Then layers of skirts, sleeves, stiffened collars, and finally, atop it all, a heavy velvet robe. The weight, anywhere from 30 to 40 pounds on average. Some queens complained of not being able to breathe. Kings sometimes fainted in summer, but tradition said more fabric meant more status, and so they suffered day after day in the name of appearance. Velvet, brocade, and silk, luxury or curse. Velvet, with its rich depth and sheen, looked divine in candlelight. Silk shimmered in the flicker of torchlight. Brocade told a silent story of hand-woven dignity, but none of it was kind. Velvet, especially, was heavy, made from silk threads painstakingly looped and cut by hand. It had poor breathability, trapping heat and moisture. On summer days, royal garments acted more like ovens than outfits. Underneath those beautiful garments, sweat would pool. Some monarchs changed multiple times a day, not because they wished to, but because they had to. Their clothes were drenched, and silk, a symbol of wealth, yes, but also a source of constant maintenance. It frayed easily, showed stains horrendously, and offered little protection from cold or heat. A lovely liability. The lurking presence of lice, even the finest linens, bleached in the sun and scrubbed with ashes, could not keep away the tiniest plague of the period, lice. They were everywhere. Cleanliness was not what we imagine it to be today. Baths were rare and often discouraged, thought to open the pores to disease. Instead, royalty masked odors with layers of perfume and fresh garments. But no matter how many times the undergarments were changed, the lice remained. They lived in seams, in collars, in the warm folds of velvet. The more layers, the more hiding spots, and scratching was common, even among queens. A few historical records, quietly mentioned in correspondence and physicians' notes, describe red rash on Her Majesty's neck or boils along the shoulder, likely signs of flea or lice infestations. For all the elegance we see on-screen, few portray the queen pausing to scratch an angry whelp mid-conversation. But it happened. Toxic beauty. The dyes that killed slowly. Royalty wore color as a sign of power. Purple for imperial might, crimson for status, deep blue for piety, green for fertility. But these colors didn't come easily or safely. Take green, for instance. A popular color for noblewomen, it was often achieved using arsenic-based compounds. Yes, arsenic, the same element that could kill in high doses. Then there was red, especially the brilliant crimson achieved from cochineal bugs or mercury-laced cinnabar. Some garments were soaked in solutions containing mercury salts to lock in color. The results? Bold, yes. Deadly, eventually. Prolonged contact with mercury or arsenic-laced fabric could lead to skin rashes, dizziness, nerve damage, or worse. In hindsight, it's not a mystery that many royals suffered from sudden madness, tremors, or fatigue. They wore poison with pride day in, day out. Stiffness, pain, and restriction. Now imagine wearing all that. The heat, the itching, the weight, but also the restriction. For noblewomen, corsets weren't simply undergarments. They were armor. Made with stiffened whalebone, iron, or even wood, they forced the torso into submission. Breathing was shallow. Movement was choreographed. Bending at the waist was nearly impossible. Men, too, weren't free. Doublets were tight. Hose had to cling. Codpieces were padded to absurd lengths for visual symbolism. And while they could move slightly more freely than their female counterparts, the emphasis on form over function made sitting, walking, or riding a constant discomfort. And shoes, narrow, pointed, flat, and stiff. They offered neither support nor comfort. There was no leisure in dressing like a royal, only ceremony. Laundry, a rare and risky affair. You may wonder, couldn't they just wash their clothes? Not really. Water was often dirty, especially in cities. Soap was rare and often caustic, made from animal fat and lye. Washing fine fabrics risked ruining them. And so, most outer garments were simply aired out, hung in drafty halls or beaten with sticks to knock off the dust and lice. Only linen undergarments were washed regularly. The rest was maintained through perfume, sun exposure, and wishful thinking. Royal closets didn't smell like rosewater and lavender. They reeked of mildew, body odor, and desperation. Symbolism over sanity. Why endure it? Because clothing was power. One's attire indicated birthright, loyalty, marital status, and religious affiliation. Certain colors were banned for commoners. Certain fabrics were legally reserved for the elite. To not dress the part was to risk social suicide, or worse, accusations of treason. When Queen Elizabeth I was asked why she dressed so elaborately even into old age, she responded, "We princes are set on stages in sight and view of all the world." Even she, the Virgin Queen, couldn't shed the burden of fashion, despite its toll. The hidden suffering behind glamour in portraits. Royalty always appears poised. But we must remember, those paintings were not snapshots of truth, they were rehearsed lies. Before sitting for a portrait, monarchs were powdered, perfumed, and plucked. They held uncomfortable poses for hours. The clothing worn in portraits often wasn't worn again. It was too heavy, too cumbersome. And the expression, always stern, always unreadable, because a smile would have been too much to hold. In private letters we glimpse the truth. Complaints about aching backs, itchy scalps, sleepless nights due to discomfort, heirs with rashes, queens with infections under their corsets, kings with skin peeled raw from tight collars and sweating silks. This was not the life of ease Netflix often shows us. It was a life of endurance, masked in embroidery. Chapter 3. No plumbing, just perfume. The castle glimmered in the early morning light, its silhouette rising nobly above the low fog that clung to the hills. Its many towers, spires, and turrets cut through the mist like the prongs of a jeweled crown. But within those thick stone walls, the air held no trace of lavender or rose water. Instead, it was thick with the musk of unwashed bodies, smoke, mildew, and something far more earthy. A royal morning did not begin with a gentle shower or a fresh set of laundered clothes. Instead, it began with the pungent scrape of a chamber pot being emptied. In the 1500s, plumbing, as we know it today, simply did not exist. There were no ceramic-tiled bathrooms, no silver taps pouring clean water, no flushing toilets, and certainly no air fresheners. Instead, members of the royal court relieved themselves in the privacy of their chambers, which sounds pleasant enough until you realize what that really meant. Each room held a chamber pot, a ceramic or metal bowl tucked beneath the bed or hidden behind a wooden screen. Royals and nobles alike would squat over these pots to relieve themselves. In some wealthier courts, the pot might have been ornately painted or gilded, but its function remained the same. After use, a servant would come to collect the waste. The pot was taken away, ideally emptied into a cesspit or moat, and then brought back to be used again. If the chamber pot overflowed before it was emptied, which was not uncommon, the odor became unbearable. And remember, this was a time when windows were small, heavy drapes hung thick over every opening, and fires smoldered throughout the day. Airflow was not a priority. Hygiene was similarly lacking. Royals might have access to scented oils and perfumes, but actual bathing was infrequent. Many people believed that bathing too often could lead to sickness, as they thought water opened the pores to disease. As a result, the court masked body odors with layers of powder, crushed flower petals, and expensive perfumes imported from far-off lands. Versailles, often depicted today as a palace of unmatched opulence, was notorious for its stench. Built for grandeur, not comfort, the palace had no toilets when it was first constructed. Even after rudimentary latrines were added, many nobles still preferred to use chamber pots or, worse, relieve themselves in stairwells and hallways. It was not unheard of for courtiers to do their business in a fireplace, behind a curtain, or even on the floor. The royal gardens offered no reprieve. Beneath the trimmed hedges and ornamental fountains, waste flowed in open trenches or was buried in shallow pits. The air outside often mirrored the stink within. Court etiquette dictated that one must pretend not to notice. If a nobleman soiled himself, or if the queen's private chamber reeked of urine, it was considered gauche to comment. Guests smiled politely, fanned themselves with perfumed handkerchiefs, and kept their discomfort hidden behind well-practiced expressions. Children were not spared from this grim reality. Royal infants wore linen swaddling clothes that absorbed waste. These were not changed frequently, nor were they always washed thoroughly. Diaper rash was common, and the smell of a royal nursery could be overwhelming. Behind the glamour of royal portraits, with their fine silks and glowing complexions, was a hidden truth. Those depicted likely hadn't bathed in weeks, wore clothes stained with sweat and food, and endured an environment thick with the smells of human waste. Courtiers kept pomanders, small, perforated containers filled with aromatic herbs, tied to their belts or necklaces to help ward off the worst of it. Lavender, clove, rosemary, and ambergris were all common choices, but no amount of crushed herbs could mask the underlying rot of unclean bodies and overflowing pots. Even royal banquets, seen so often romanticized, were plagued by filth. With little concern for sanitation, guests would relieve themselves between courses or step out into the halls and return without washing. Servants scurried behind them to clear plates and chamber pots alike. The rush to maintain appearances meant that cleaning was done in haste, and the scent lingered despite efforts to keep up. In some castles, waste disposal was even more primitive. Privies were built into the castle walls, with holes leading to the outer moat or a pit below. In theory, gravity did the work. In practice, these pits often filled quickly and were rarely emptied. The smell would rise back up the chute, especially in summer, filling entire wings with the scent of decay. The danger wasn't just olfactory. Disease thrived in these conditions. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses ran rampant through royal courts. Medical knowledge was limited, and the connection between cleanliness and health was poorly understood. A single contaminated well could doom an entire household. The role of a servant tasked with managing waste was one of the lowest in the pecking order. The gong farmer, as they were sometimes called in England, was responsible for digging out cesspits and hauling waste away by the barrel. Their clothes were permanently stained, and they were forced to live on the outskirts of society, both literally and figuratively. Yet even the royals were not exempt from the consequences. Their privilege could provide gold, land, and armies, but it could not spare them from the putrid reality of everyday existence. Kings and queens fell ill, suffered infections, and died young. The most lavish castle could not mask the underlying truth. Without plumbing, life was rank. When modern audiences marvel at historical dramas, they see the gleam of silverware, the rustle of silk gowns, the glint of chandeliers. But they rarely catch the wrinkle of a nose, the shift of a fan, the sideways glance that meant someone nearby had soiled themselves. Perfume, for all its grace, was a cover, an attempt to sweeten a world that stank from the ground up. It was applied thick and often, but it never quite succeeded. The true scent of royalty in the 1500s was not rosewater. It was sweat, urine, rot, and desperation. And perhaps when you peel back the layers of gold and velvet, that is the most human part of them all. Chapter 4. Marriage was a political prison, forget romance. Marriages were arranged like trade deals, and often involved children marrying strangers for power. Let us begin with a dream. Not yours, but the one spun centuries later by playwrights, novelists, and modern streaming services. A golden-haired princess, cloaked in velvet, gazes longingly from a castle window. Her eyes search the horizon, awaiting the return of her beloved, perhaps a brave knight or a foreign prince dashing in kind. Love, they say, will conquer all. But this, dear listener, is not our story. No, our story takes place behind the silks and tapestries, in drafty halls echoing with political whispers, in cold stone chambers where love is a stranger and duty is the only familiar face. Let us talk today, softly and carefully, about marriage in the royal courts of the 1500s, and how it was far less a fairy tale and far more a cage. The bargain of bloodlines in the 1500s, royalty was not just a family. It was a currency. Marriage was the ultimate transaction. It was diplomacy with a dowry, an agreement inked in titles and sealed with ceremonies. Behind every royal wedding gown was a treaty, and behind every groom's polished boots, a pair of advisors counting territories. Love, if it came at all, was an afterthought. A young princess, perhaps only 9 or 10, would be betrothed not because she longed for companionship, but because her union would bring peace between two kingdoms, or reinforce a claim to a throne, or ensure that a rebellious duchy did not become an enemy. Royal children were bartered before they could understand the meaning of the word choice. They were chess pieces, and the board was Europe. Too young to wed, yet promised all the same. Imagine you are 7 years old. You like ribbons, or perhaps butterflies, or stories told by your nursemaid before the fire. And then one morning, your governess tells you gently that you are engaged. Your bridegroom is a boy you've never met, or worse, he's a man of 35 with a beard and a kingdom by the sea. The ink is dry, the agreement has been signed, and you, without ever lifting a pen, are no longer yours. Many royal girls were engaged while still learning their letters. Some were married before they understood the meaning of the word. Though consummation might be delayed until puberty, the chains of obligation were fastened early. Princess Margaret Tudor was married to King James IV of Scotland in her early teens. Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to France at just 5 years old to be raised alongside her future husband, the Dauphin Francis. She didn't get to choose what clothes to wear. She didn't get to choose what language to speak. She certainly didn't choose her husband, and she was one of the lucky ones. A queen by title, a stranger by bed. Once the marriage was finalized, the real journey began. A princess, raised in one court, was sent far from home, sometimes across the sea. She was expected to adopt a new language, embrace new customs, and win the favor of a foreign court, all while sharing a bed with a man she barely knew. The nights were cold, even when the beds were shared. Intimacy was often awkward, sometimes forced, rarely affectionate. A queen was not a wife in the modern sense. She was an asset. Her primary role was to produce heirs, preferably sons, and not to interfere in state matters unless invited. If she failed in this duty, she might find herself discarded, or worse. Consider Catherine of Aragon, first wife of England's King Henry VIII. Married first to his brother, Arthur, at the age of 15, she was widowed by 16, then remarried to Henry, only to be cast aside after decades of loyalty when she failed to produce a male heir. She had been a queen, a faithful partner, a daughter of Spain. None of it saved her from disgrace. Marriage, you see, had conditions, and affection was never guaranteed. The role of the groom, pawn in a crown, men did not always fare better. A royal prince might dream of adventure, of war, of valor. But often he was told to marry a woman for whom he felt nothing, to unite two houses, or to lay claim to distant lands. Prince Philip of Spain, for example, was married to Queen Mary I of England. He was 27. She was 37 and desperate for a child. Their marriage was deeply unpopular in England. He could not speak the language. She was often ill. The alliance was one of politics, not pleasure. And when Mary died childless, Philip's position in England vanished. So too did any illusion of marital closeness. Even kings were not immune to loneliness, especially when love was never the point to begin with. Romance found elsewhere. When affection is absent from the marital bed, it often seeks warmth elsewhere. Courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, handsome guards, charming poets. Royal marriages were frequently open secrets. Affairs were expected, though not always accepted. Queens were carefully watched, for their children needed to be unquestionably royal. But kings had more freedom. Mistresses were a fact of court life. Some, like Diane de Poitiers, wielded more power than ministers. Some bore children. Some shaped history. And some queens, like Anne of Austria or Catherine de' Medici, turned a blind eye because they had no choice. For a royal bride, jealousy was useless. The crown weighed more than the heart. The dowry and the debt. Let us not forget the dowry, the sum paid by the bride's family to seal the union. This was not a small gift. It was land, gold, jewels, ships, sometimes entire towns. If the dowry failed to arrive, the marriage might be canceled. If the bride died young, her dowry could spark diplomatic outrage. In some cases, the bride herself was the dowry. Consider Isabella of Portugal, whose marriage to Charles V brought Spain not only wealth but political unity. Her body, her heritage, her womb, all were assets, measured and appraised. And if the marriage ended poorly, through war, betrayal, or death, the loss of that dowry could lead to national debt, rebellion, or war. A princess could cost a kingdom everything. Escape was rare. Regret was common. Some royals tried to escape their fates. Elizabeth I of England famously refused to marry at all, choosing instead to reign as the Virgin Queen. Her decision was political, yes, but also personal. She had watched her sister Mary's miserable union. She had witnessed her mother, Anne Boleyn, beheaded by her own father. Elizabeth understood that royal marriage was not romantic. It was dangerous. Others were not so lucky. Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated her throne rather than marry. She left her crown behind, and with it, the only life she had ever known. Such acts were rare and risky. Most royals stayed in their arranged prisons, locked by golden vows. The legacy of forced unions. What did this system leave behind? Centuries of dynastic instability. Children who did not know love. Courts brimming with mistrust. Alliances that crumbled the moment one partner died. And thousands upon thousands of letters between kings and diplomats, between daughters and mothers, lamenting the loneliness behind the throne. Marriage for royals in the 1500s was seldom about two people. It was about borders, crowns, wars postponed or incited. It was not a dance in candlelight. It was a contract in iron. So the next time you see a royal wedding in fiction, satin gowns, whispered promises, swelling music, remember this. Behind every romantic vow in the 1500s was a ledger, a treaty, a whisper of ambition, and more often than not, a tear. Because marriage was not made for love. It was made for empire, and love in that world was a dangerous indulgence. Chapter 5. Baths were optional once a month, maybe. Cleanliness wasn't common. Some thought bathing caused disease. You stank, but so did everyone else. In the grand halls of 16th century palaces, amid the flickering torchlight, the rustle of embroidered fabrics, and the heavy scent of dried herbs hanging from tapestries, there was one inescapable truth: everyone stank. This chapter is not one to be read with romantic notions of scented oils and steaming marble baths, nor should one imagine a daily soak as portrayed in glossy period dramas. Instead, to walk in the shoes, or rather, the sweat-soaked slippers, of a Tudor monarch or a French king is to understand that cleanliness was a relative concept. And it was very, very different from what we expect today. A world without running water to begin. Let's imagine your average day as a royal in the 1500s. You awaken beneath a canopy of velvet and damask, embroidered with gold thread and lined with furs. It sounds luxurious, doesn't it? Except the linens haven't been washed in weeks, possibly months, and the room smells faintly of mildew, chamber pots, and stale body odor. You groggily rise from bed, perhaps helped by a servant, and begin your day without a shower. Not because there wasn't time, but because you wouldn't have considered it. The plumbing systems we take for granted did not exist. To bathe required effort. Servants hauling heavy buckets of water, heating them over fires, pouring them into a wooden or tin tub lined with cloth to prevent splinters. That wasn't something done on a whim. That was a production. Bathing. A suspicious practice. The idea of not bathing might seem shocking today, but in the 1500s, water was a risky business. Many physicians of the time believed that water could open the pores and allow disease to enter the body. Bathing, too, frequently was thought to weaken the natural defenses. Take, for example, King Louis XIV of France. He ruled in splendor at Versailles and is often associated with decadence and fashion. Yet, it's widely believed that he only bathed, fully immersed in water, twice in his entire life. Even that is contested. Physicians would recommend dry rubbing with linen cloths instead of using water. Royal hygiene often consisted of changing undergarments rather than washing the body itself. Linen, they believed, absorbed bodily filth and sweat, so changing one's shirt was, in essence, a form of washing. The medical consensus at the time drew upon Galenic theory, where the body was believed to be ruled by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much moisture, or too much dryness, was seen as potentially upsetting the delicate balance. So, immersing oneself in water, that was playing with fire. The bathhouse decline. Public bathhouses had once been popular across Europe, especially in the earlier medieval period. But by the 1500s, they had fallen out of favor, particularly due to associations with immorality and, later, syphilis. Many bathhouses were shut down as places of sin and infection. The Protestant Reformation added further moral scrutiny. Leaders like John Calvin preached personal austerity, and public bathing, with its pagan roots and sensual associations, was increasingly condemned. Cleanliness began to be seen less as a bodily state and more as a spiritual one. And so, royals found other ways to stay clean. Perfumes, powders, and pomanders. Instead of washing, royals masked their odor. Fragrance was a powerful tool in the 1500s, not just of fashion but of status. Perfumes were used liberally, on clothes, on handkerchiefs, on gloves. Pomanders, which were metal orbs filled with aromatic substances like cloves, cinnamon, and ambergris, were worn or carried to ward off bad smells, and more importantly, what was believed to be miasma, or bad air that carried disease. Rooms were filled with scented herbs. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were scattered on floors to help cover the human odors lingering in the air. Clothing itself was often perfumed during the cleaning process, if not heavily laundered. The goal wasn't to be clean, it was to smell as though you were clean. The royal bath, an event, not a routine when a king or queen did bathe, it was ceremonial. Preparations were extensive. Take the case of Queen Elizabeth I. Records suggest she bathed about once a month, which, believe it or not, was considered progressive. Her bath involved a large wooden tub lined with linen. Water had to be carried in, bucket, by servants. It was then scented with rose petals or herbs. A curtain might be drawn around the tub, not for privacy, but to keep drafts out. Cold air was believed to be dangerous to the body when wet. Afterward she would be dried and powdered, then layered again in her garments with freshly laundered linen underclothes. The whole affair took hours. It was hardly the relaxing spa day we imagine. Hair, teeth, and everything in between hair washing was another ordeal. Most royals didn't wash their hair with water at all. Instead, they used cloths to rub it down or powders to absorb oils. Wigs, which became more common later in the century, were often powdered and perfumed rather than cleaned. Toothbrushing was rare, though some royals chewed on twigs or used cloth to wipe their teeth. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly used a paste made of honey and ground eggshells. Effective, perhaps marginally, but without modern dental care, even royals suffered from rotten teeth and bad breath. Some monarchs lost teeth early in life and wore wooden or ivory replacements. Henry VIII, for instance, was known to have terrible dental hygiene in his later years. His breath was so bad, courtiers would keep their distance despite his demand for constant attention. Clothes as a shield from dirt in many ways, clothing functioned as a kind of barrier. Royals dressed in layers upon layers of fabric, linen undershirts, silk doublets, velvet outer garments. The linen was the only thing washed regularly, as it was believed to absorb dirt and sweat. Some people wore the same outer garments for weeks on end. There are records of nobles sending entire outfits to be aired out rather than washed. But imagine wearing 20 pounds of fabric in the heat of summer, all without deodorant, without a bath, without clean hair. Then imagine attending a royal feast, crammed into a stuffy great hall with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of equally unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Court life and the smell of power despite the discomfort. Nobody found this strange. The concept of bad smell was so normalized that the nose adapted. If you smelled like sweat, animal grease, wood smoke, and perfume, you smelled like everyone else. Even love and romance were not immune to this reality. Suitors wooed each other while reeking of musk and cloaked in scented oils. Courtiers used fans to wave away body odor, but they never thought to question the cause. Personal attendants, often in charge of dressing, grooming, and even wiping the royal rear with soft cloths or sponges, were not there to assist in bathing. They were there to maintain the illusion of cleanliness. The royal toilet, a fragrant affair, and what of toilets? For all the grandeur of palaces, the restroom situation was rather crude. The garderobe was a simple hole in a wooden bench, sometimes dropping straight down into a cesspit or the moat. At Versailles, chamber pots were used widely, and waste was often dumped out of windows or into nearby channels. The English monarchs had close stools, essentially portable toilets, lined with velvet, attended by the groom of the stool. This intimate servant role held more political power than one might expect, simply due to their access to the monarch during private moments. Yet, with all these arrangements, the palace still stank. People grew used to it. Aromatic herbs, incense, and even tobacco were used to clear the air, but little truly helped. Disease and the illusion of clean, ironically, the very fear that bathing would cause illness was not unfounded, but for reasons misunderstood at the time. Public water sources were often contaminated with human and animal waste. So yes, bathing in polluted water could make you sick, but instead of improving sanitation, the solution became avoidance. This misunderstanding persisted for centuries, reinforced by personal anecdotes and long-standing traditions. For royals, this meant clinging to dry washing methods and perfume as a substitute for hygiene. A different definition of clean to be royal in the 1500s was not to be clean, at least not by modern standards. It was to be visibly clean, olfactorily acceptable, and ritually tended to. The illusion of cleanliness, sparkling gowns, gilded mirrors, embroidered gloves, masked the grimy reality. And as long as the illusion held, no one questioned it. Open Book Chapter 6. Royal medicine was more dangerous than the illness. Let us drift gently into the world of the 1500s. A world painted in the gold of courtly robes, velvet-lined chambers, and tapestries woven with silver threads. A world often imagined as a place where kings and queens lounged in silken beds, waited upon by physicians with wisdom beyond their years. But beneath the shimmering surface, hidden behind carved wooden doors and velvet curtains, lay a much less comforting truth. When a royal took ill, it was not a matter of calling a team of skilled doctors with sterile instruments and cutting-edge treatments. No. In the 1500s, medicine, even for the most powerful people in the world, was an experiment wrapped in superstition, a ritual that often caused more harm than healing. This chapter will slowly peel back the embroidered curtains of royal health care in the 16th century. And as we do, you may find yourself grateful for the simple convenience of a modern painkiller or a trusted family doctor. Settle in. Let us take a calm, steady walk through the world of royal medicine, where bloodletting was a science, leeches were your closest companions, and a headache might earn you a trepanning. Thermometer Part 1. The royal body, a sacred burden in the courts of the 1500s, the body of the king or queen, was not considered just a physical form. It was both symbolic and sacred. Monarchs were often thought to have been appointed by divine will, and thus, their health was considered a matter of state and spirit alike. If a king coughed too loudly at court, whispers spread like wildfire. If a queen looked pale, it could spark rumors of witchcraft, curses, or even divine punishment. Because of this, royal bodies were constantly observed. Their bowel movements were recorded, their sleep patterns monitored, their humors, those mysterious fluids believed to govern the body's health, were studied and adjusted with strange and dangerous techniques. And yet, despite all this attention, the understanding of disease was primitive. Germ theory wouldn't be discovered for another 3 centuries. Illness was thought to come from bad air, imbalanced humors, or divine punishment. And when something was believed to come from the gods or the stars, no one questioned the logic of bleeding a man until he fainted. Part 2. The madness of bloodletting. Imagine a room lit only by candlelight. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax, sweat, and something metallic. A physician in heavy robes bends over a patient, the king himself, while court attendants hold their breath. A vein is opened, a bowl is placed beneath it. Bloodletting was not just a treatment, it was the treatment. Fever, let blood, headache, let blood, madness, hysteria, indigestion, or a troubled dream, let blood. The belief stemmed from the ancient idea of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, it was believed, came from imbalance. And so, physicians, trained in universities or apprenticed by masters of dubious skill, resorted to methods aimed at restoring balance. Chief among them was the practice of drawing blood. Leeches were common, especially for royals, because they were seen as less invasive. But even so, they could lead to infection or worse. Often, doctors opened veins with sharp, unsanitized blades. Blood poured into pewter bowls or stained linen, and the patient was encouraged to sleep afterward, pale and weak. Queen Elizabeth I herself is believed to have undergone bloodletting multiple times in her life. Her physicians likely believed it was beneficial, even as it drained her energy and left her vulnerable to secondary illness. In truth, it wasn't the disease that was killing royals, it was the cure. Skull Part 3. Mercury and the deathly doctors. Let us now turn to a substance that glittered like silver and flowed like water: mercury. It was beautiful, it was mysterious, and it was deadly. In the 1500s, mercury was often prescribed as a treatment for various ailments, particularly syphilis, a disease that ravaged both the upper and lower classes in equal measure. Physicians believed that mercury could purge the body of disease. Royals who contracted syphilis were made to ingest it, rub it into their skin, or inhale it as a vapor. In many cases, mercury treatment led to bleeding gums, tooth loss, and trembling. In more advanced stages, patients went mad, driven to hallucinations and violent fits. But because their doctors said the medicine was working, they accepted the madness as part of the healing. Even Catherine de' Medici, the powerful Queen of France, was known to experiment with alchemical treatments, including mercury-laced tonics. She had access to the most elite minds of her time, yet they too believed in cures that today would be classified as slow poisons. Royalty did not have access to better medicine, just more of it, and that often meant more suffering. Brain Part 4. Trepanning, the royal hole in the head. The practice of trepanning, drilling a hole into the skull, may sound barbaric, and yet it was a respected treatment in the 1500s for migraines, seizures, and even melancholia. Yes, even depression had a surgical solution in the royal court. Patients were laid down, sometimes given alcohol as anesthesia, and their skulls were slowly opened by careful drilling. The goal: to release evil spirits or rebalance the mind. If a prince or duke suffered from madness, this could be the solution. And if he died from the procedure, as many did, it was often attributed to the demons that had been too strong to escape. Royal records in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire contain vague references to noblemen, made well through divine cranial intervention, a likely euphemism for trepanning gone wrong. One can only imagine the horror of undergoing brain surgery with no understanding of brain function, by candlelight, with no anesthesia and no knowledge of infection control. Herb Part 5. Herbal guesswork and royal apothecaries. Not all treatments were so extreme. Many royal households employed apothecaries, herbalists trained in the use of plants, roots, and oils to soothe or heal. Lavender was used for sleep, mint for digestion, clove for toothaches, chamomile for nerves. Honey and vinegar were mixed to cleanse wounds, but even these gentler options came with risks. Dosage was imprecise. Identification of herbs could be flawed, and while some remedies worked, many were based on folklore rather than evidence. One famous case is that of King Charles IX of France, who suffered from chronic migraines. His herbalist provided a tonic of poppy seeds and belladonna. The latter, also known as deadly nightshade, was a poison in anything more than the smallest amounts. Charles's headaches may have eased for a time until his eyesight began to blur and his speech slurred. Whether it was the disease or the cure that hastened his decline, we may never know. Crystal Ball Part 6. Astrology and the timing of illness. To truly understand royal medicine, we must also look up to the stars. Medical decisions were often guided by astrology. When a king fell ill, his physicians didn't just examine his body. They examined the sky. A royal birth chart could determine when blood should be let, when a purge should be done, or when to apply leeches. Doctors waited for the moon to be in a favorable house, or for Mars to pass through a non-threatening alignment. If the stars were wrong, even the most desperate treatments were postponed. In some courts, astrologers wielded more influence than surgeons. Illness was celestial, they claimed. To ignore the heavens was to invite disaster. This was not unique to one region. Courts in England, Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia all practiced medical astrology to some degree. So even if a king coughed up blood or a queen suffered a fever, treatment might wait until Venus aligned with Saturn. Sponge Part 7. Cleanliness was not next to godliness. You might think a royal palace would be clean, sterile, and sweet-smelling. But in truth, hygiene in the 1500s was minimal, and this affected royal medicine profoundly. Bathing was infrequent. Some physicians believed water opened the pores and made one more vulnerable to disease. Wounds were bandaged with dirty linen. Surgical tools were wiped, not sterilized. Even the royal sickroom, adorned with gold-threaded canopies, was more a chamber of infection than healing. A simple cut could fester. A fever could spread to an entire household. And because many diseases were poorly understood, quarantine was rare. Doctors themselves often wore robes caked in blood and pus from previous patients. The same hands that treated a peasant might later tend to a prince, with no washing in between. Coffin Part 8. Death came quietly, often in silence despite their riches. Royalty often died in silence and confusion. Their physicians, desperate to cure them, might have tried everything: leeches, trepanning, enemas of herbs, mercury tonics, prayers, astrology, and bleeding, but to no avail. Autopsies were rare and often forbidden, so the cause of death remained mysterious. The blame was cast on fate, sin, or divine punishment. And yet quietly their deaths echoed one another: weakness from bleeding, poison from mercury, infection from unclean tools, madness from trepanning. The royal funeral would be grand, but the cause of death would remain a footnote. Chapter 7. The royal diet was just sad. If you were to step into a grand hall in a 16th century royal palace, you might be mesmerized by the array of dishes set before the monarch. Towering pies, glistening roasted birds, sugared fruits, and ornate platters spilling over with meat might paint a picture of indulgence and luxury. But beneath this gilded surface, the royal diet of the 1500s was neither healthy nor particularly enjoyable by modern standards. In truth, it was a sluggish parade of meat-heavy monotony, poor nutrition, and stomach-churning consequences. A feast of meat, and more meat. Royal meals in the 1500s were centered around excess, not because of flavor or diversity, but because of social and cultural expectations. Meat was king. The more meat served, the more wealth and status one displayed. Royals consumed beef, pork, mutton, veal, venison, swan, peacock, and even dolphin or porpoise during religious observances when red meat was forbidden. Birds, both wild and domestic, were roasted, baked into pies, or stuffed in intricate displays that sometimes mimicked their living appearance. The royal table rarely saw vegetables, at least not intentionally. Vegetables were considered food for peasants. Root vegetables, onions, and leeks might appear occasionally, but green leafy vegetables, practically non-existent. Salads were a novelty, often dressed with sugar, vinegar, or rose water. It was not uncommon to find fruit doused in wine or baked into pastries more for show than substance. Fiber. Never heard of her. The concept of dietary fiber, of course, hadn't been discovered. Whole grains were out of the question for royalty. White bread, painstakingly sieved and milled to remove every last husk and fleck of bran, was a mark of elite refinement. While peasants chewed on coarser, darker loaves rich in nutrients, the upper class dined on snowy white manchet bread made with fine wheat flour. This obsession with refinement meant that roughage was almost entirely absent from the royal diet. Combine this with a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, and you had a recipe for one of the least glamorous royal afflictions: chronic constipation. The palace of pain. Constipation at court. It was a problem so prevalent that it was openly discussed in letters, journals, and court records. Monarchs were often noted to be in ill humor or unwell from their humors, which frequently translated to they hadn't had a proper bowel movement in days. Court physicians often attributed these ailments to imbalanced humors, a medical theory that dominated until the 18th century. But the real culprit was likely diet and inactivity. Henry VIII, for instance, reportedly suffered from severe digestive issues, which only worsened with age. The bloating, lethargy, and constant discomfort were not helped by the heavy meals and sedentary lifestyle. Some royals resorted to purging, either through emetics or enemas, which were administered regularly as part of a courtly health routine. Sugar, spice, and everything lethal. Sugar was not just a treat, it was a status symbol. Imported from distant colonies, sugar was a luxury that only the rich could afford in abundance. And so, they used it on everything. Sugar was sprinkled on meats, added to sauces, and baked into elaborate marzipan sculptures. Dental hygiene, however, was non-existent. The result: rotten teeth, constant toothaches, and infected gums. Queen Elizabeth I was famously secretive about the state of her teeth, which were blackened and decaying from years of sugary indulgence. Her courtiers, trying to mimic her fashion, even began blackening their own teeth to show that they too could afford such luxuries. Drinks all around water in the 1500s was not trusted, and for good reason. Contaminated and unsafe, drinking water was a quick path to illness. As a result, people drank alcohol, a lot of it. Royals consumed wine and ale from morning until night. Wine might be diluted with water or spiced, but it was still alcoholic. This constant alcohol intake further complicated digestive problems. Dehydration was common, and headaches and sluggishness were treated with more food and drink. The idea of hydration as we understand it today simply didn't exist. The ceremony of excess royal banquets were not just meals, they were performances. Pages in livery carried trays of food through long corridors, trumpets blared to announce new courses, and dishes arrived in carefully choreographed succession. Often, the king or queen barely ate at these events. The food was for show, and what wasn't eaten might be distributed to nobles or even the poor as a gesture of generosity. Behind the scenes, the royal kitchens were chaotic places of labor. Dozens of cooks, servants, spit boys, and scullions worked in sweltering heat, churning out hundreds of dishes. Hygiene was rudimentary at best. Meat was often preserved with salt or smoked, and fresh produce, when available, was a rarity. Cross-contamination and spoiled food were common, leading to outbreaks of food poisoning that could decimate entire households. Feasts that lasted for days. A royal feast wasn't a single dinner. It was an endurance event. Coronations, weddings, diplomatic visits, each called for a series of feasts that might stretch on for days. Gluttony was encouraged, and those who couldn't keep up with the excessive consumption were seen as weak or effeminate. Accounts from the time describe courtiers vomiting mid-meal to make room for more food. Others passed out from drink. Servants were tasked with cleaning up after these events, often finding themselves dealing with messes that no one talks about in modern period dramas. No concept of balance, the concept of a balanced diet was foreign. Meals weren't constructed with health in mind, but with symbolism, spectacle, and excess. The richer and rarer the ingredient, the better. A pie containing live birds that would fly out when cut open was not an urban legend. It was entertainment. This unbalanced intake of rich foods meant royals were often plagued by gout, indigestion, obesity, and a myriad of other diet-related afflictions. Gout was so common among the upper class it was dubbed the disease of kings. Royal physicians and their guesswork court physicians, for all their learning, had little true understanding of nutrition or health. They operated under the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each food was classified by its properties: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and treatment involved trying to rebalance the body through bleeding, purging, or diet. If a king was melancholic, he might be prescribed a diet of warm, dry foods, which usually meant more roasted meat. If he had too much phlegm, spicy foods might be added. There was little room for scientific accuracy. The false glamour of opulence, what we often see portrayed in films and television, is the extravagance of royal dining, the gleaming banquets, golden goblets, and sumptuous feasts. But behind those visuals lies a grim reality, a diet that wreaked havoc on the body, poorly understood health practices, and a culture of excess with no room for self-care or sustainability. Far from being a dream of indulgent luxury, royal dining in the 1500s was a slow, rich, oversalted crawl toward digestive disaster. Royals may have been surrounded by food, but they weren't nourished. Their lives were filled with ceremony, spectacle, and suffering, the kind of quiet suffering no one mentions when the trumpets sound and the feast begins. So the next time you watch a royal drama and see a king raising a goblet over a table piled high with meat and pastry, remember, somewhere off-screen, there's a physician preparing an enema and a monarch quietly regretting his second swan pie. Chapter 8. You couldn't trust anyone, even family. The halls of the royal palace may have been gilded in gold and lined with elaborate tapestries, but within those stone walls lay a web of whispers, secrets, and schemes. To be royal in the 1500s was to be both powerful and perpetually at risk, not from foreign enemies alone, but from those seated closest to you at the banquet table. The very people who kissed your hand by day might poison your goblet by night. In the modern era, royal families appear bound together by ceremony and duty, often portrayed as unified, if not loving, in televised series. But history tells a far colder, more brutal truth. In the 1500s, trust was a luxury few monarchs could afford, especially when betrayal often came not from foes across the sea, but from within the family. A crown worth killing for inheritance wasn't guaranteed by primogeniture alone. While in theory, the eldest son inherited the throne, in practice, succession could be violently contested. With multiple children from multiple marriages, blended families, and widespread favoritism, royal bloodlines became battlefields. A younger brother might feel more suited for the crown. A cousin might be convinced the king was illegitimate. An uncle might see himself as a stabilizing figure in tumultuous times. For every secure monarch, there were dozens who fell to plots hatched in their own households. Consider Richard III of England, whose nephews mysteriously vanished in the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Or Ivan the Terrible of Russia, who murdered his own son in a fit of rage. Royal blood did not ensure compassion. Often, it made familial relationships more dangerous. Murder as a political tool to the royals of the 1500s, murder wasn't madness. It was often necessity. Poisonings were among the preferred methods of dispatch. Arsenic, known as the inheritance powder, was a favorite, and recipes for it passed through courtly circles as readily as gossip. Death by poison allowed plausible deniability. A fever, a stomach ailment, a quiet funeral. No one needs suspect treachery. In Florence, the infamous Borgia family mastered the art of subtle elimination. Lucrezia Borgia, though later somewhat exonerated by historians, was long rumored to carry a hollow ring that dispensed poison into drinks. Whether fact or fabrication, the belief persisted because it aligned with the lived fears of the era. Anyone, especially family, could be a threat. The fragile dance of alliances, marriage, too, was a gamble. Royals wed not for love but for alliances, and each union shifted the balance of power. A brother married to a foreign princess might gain foreign troops to support a coup. A sister might bear children with stronger claims to the throne. Even mothers were not beyond suspicion. A queen dowager might plot to place her son on the throne, even if it meant deposing her stepson. This dance of shifting loyalties meant that monarchs often kept family members under tight surveillance. Siblings were exiled or confined under house arrest. Cousins were given meaningless titles and kept far from court. Even children were watched, their tutors chosen for loyalty rather than learning. Letters, lies, and spycraft, if one imagined courtly correspondence was filled with tender words and familial affection, they'd be sorely mistaken. Letters were tools of manipulation, bargaining chips, and occasionally, evidence of conspiracy. The postal systems of the time were rudimentary, and many kings employed code breakers to intercept and decrypt messages. A simple letter to a cousin in France could lead to imprisonment. Henry VIII, paranoid and politically astute, had networks of spies within his own family. His courtiers carefully monitored the actions of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, fearing that foreign factions might use them to usurp power. Their own half-sister, Jane Grey, ruled for 9 days before being beheaded, a pawn in a larger political game. The price of paranoia, living in fear of betrayal, takes a toll, even on the powerful. Monarchs became increasingly suspicious, erratic, and ruthless. Ivan the Terrible's growing instability mirrored his increasing isolation. In England, Elizabeth I famously avoided marriage altogether, likely understanding that even a husband could be a threat to her autonomy. Royal courts became echo chambers of flattery, with truth hidden behind layers of diplomacy. A single whispered rumor could lead to exile or death. And so monarchs lived in gilded cages, richer than any peasant but far less free. Blood isn't always thicker. The 1500s are replete with examples of fratricide, regicide, and betrayal. In the Ottoman Empire, the practice of fratricide was not only common but institutionalized. Upon ascending the throne, a new sultan often executed his brothers to prevent future uprisings. This brutal policy, though horrific, was seen as a necessary evil to preserve stability. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, princes regularly fought over territories, using family disputes as pretexts for war. The fragile alliances among royal houses often cracked under the pressure of ambition and jealousy. Legacy of mistrust. This culture of betrayal didn't end with a coronation. It passed from one generation to the next, a tradition of treachery. Kings taught their sons to rule with suspicion. Queens taught their daughters to scheme for survival. Children were raised not in warmth and affection, but in the cold knowledge that power corrupts and family doesn't always mean loyalty. Behind every coronation portrait and ceremonial robe lay a story of a brother imprisoned, a cousin poisoned, or a mother exiled. These weren't tragedies reserved for the history books. They were everyday realities of life at court. A warning from the past today: dramatized depictions of royalty often gloss over these gritty truths. We admire the opulence and ignore the anxiety. We see the coronation, not the conspiracies. But for those who lived it, royalty was not a fairy tale. It was a high-stakes game played with blood. And in that game, even your own family could be your most dangerous enemy.